Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. Listen carefully. What you're about to hear are 6 nightmare encounters from deep Appalachia. Real people faced true evil in these mountains and barely escaped with their lives. The woods are watching, the mountains remember, and they never let go. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me where you're from. It's time. Let's dive into the horror. I'm 31, and I work maintenance at Pineville Elementary, which ain't much, but it keeps food on the table for me and my daughter Kayla. We ended up in Harlan County after her mama took off last winter. Just packed her bags one morning while Kayla was at school and left a note saying she couldn't do this anymore. Can't say I blame her entirely. Living hand to mouth in these mountains ain't easy, especially when you're from somewhere else like Jennifer was. But Kayla's my blood, and I wasn't about to let her get bounced around between relatives while I figured things out. The trailer we're renting sits in Blackwater Hollow, about 15 miles up a gravel road from the nearest paved street. It's one of maybe 8 mobile homes scattered along what used to be Peabody Coal Company land before the mine played out in the 80s. My landlord, Ezra Mullins, said his daddy worked those tunnels for 40 years before black lung got him. The rent's dirt cheap because most folks around here got their own family land passed down through generations. They don't need to rent. The only people who end up in Blackwater Hollow are outsiders or locals who've fallen on especially hard times. Our trailer's decent enough: 2 bedrooms, a narrow galley kitchen, and a living room that gets cramped when 7-year-old Kayla spreads out her coloring books and those chapter books she's always reading. She's smart as a whip, that girl. Reads at a 5th grade level, even though she just finished first. Gets that from her mama's side, I reckon. The trailer sits maybe 50 yards from where the hollow starts climbing steep toward Coffin Mountain, named that because the old-timers say it's shaped like a burial box when you see it from the valley below. Kayla took to mountain life better than I expected. She's always been good at making the best of things. Has to be, with how our luck's been running. The nearest neighbor kid is Tommy Messer, but he's 12, and thinks 7-year-olds are babies, so mostly Kayla entertains herself. She likes sitting on our little front porch after supper, drawing pictures or reading while I drink a beer and watch the fireflies come out. Sometimes she'll ask me to tell her stories about when I was little, growing up in these same mountains before I moved to Lexington and met her mama. The woods behind our place are old-growth timber that somehow escaped the logging companies, massive oaks and maples and hemlocks that block out most of the sky even in winter. Kayla was fascinated by them from day one, always staring out our back window like she was watching for something. I told her she could play at the edge where I could see her from the house, but not to go in far enough to lose sight of our roof. Single dad rules. I worry about everything twice as much as I probably should, especially with all the old mine shafts and abandoned equipment scattered through these hills. For about 6 weeks, everything felt as normal as anything gets when you're starting over. I'd leave for work at 6:30, drop Kayla at Mima Mullins' place down the hollow. Ezra's mother watches kids for grocery money, then pick her up around 4 when my shift ended. Evenings we'd have supper while she told me about her day, bath time at 7:30. Bedtime by 8 with a story or 2 if I wasn't too beat. Weekends we'd drive into town for groceries at the IGA and maybe stop at the library if I had gas money left over. The mountains felt peaceful then, protective even. Mornings you'd wake up to mist hanging in the hollows like cotton batting, and evenings you could hear whippoorwills calling from ridge to ridge. Kayla loved listening to them. "They sound lonesome, Daddy," she'd say, like they're looking for their families. But then she started having the dreams. It began sometime in October, right when the leaves were turning and you could smell wood smoke from people firing up their stoves for the first time. Kayla would wake up screaming around 2 or 3 in the morning, and when I'd run to her room, she'd be sitting up in bed with tears streaming down her face, talking about the coal woman who lived under Coffin Mountain. "She's tall and black like the coal seam, Daddy." Kayla would tell me when I'd sit on her bed and try to calm her down. But her face moves like a person's face, and she's got too many teeth, all white and sharp like icicles. She stands in the mine opening and watches our house through the trees. I'd hold her until she fell back asleep, telling her it was just a dream, that there wasn't anybody living in the old mines. But the nightmares kept coming, 3 or 4 times a week, always around the same time, always about this coal woman. During the day, Kayla started drawing pictures of her, these detailed crayon sketches of a tall, thin figure made of what looked like black rock, with red dots for eyes and a mouth full of jagged white triangles. The drawings had a precision that seemed too advanced for a 7-year-old, like she was copying something she'd actually seen rather than imagining it. What bothered me most was how the coal woman in the pictures seemed to be getting closer to our trailer with each drawing. First, she was just a dark shape between distant trees. Then she was at the edge of our clearing. Then she was standing right at the tree line behind our place, one long arm reaching toward the house. I asked Meemaw Mullins if she'd heard Kayla mention any bad dreams. The old woman got this funny look on her weathered face and said, "That youngin's been asking me about the mine women. Wanted to know if they really used to live under the mountain before the coal company came." She leaned closer and lowered her voice. "My grandmother used to tell stories about them, Cherokee women who got trapped in the mountain when the white miners came and sealed up the old passages, said they turned to coal and root and stone, waiting for someone to hear their songs again. You didn't tell Kayla those stories, did you?" "Law, no. But these mountains got their own way of talking to folks who listen. Always have." The drawings kept multiplying, taped to Kayla's bedroom walls, stuffed in her backpack, scattered across the kitchen table when I'd get home from work. Always the same figure, but now, sometimes, there'd be other shapes in the background, smaller figures that looked like children made of the same black stone. And in the newest drawings, there'd be a little girl with long hair standing next to the coal woman, holding her hand. "Who's that little girl, baby?" I asked one evening while we were eating leftover cornbread and beans. "That's me when I'm ready," she said without looking up from her coloring. "The coal woman gets lonesome under the mountain. She wants a daughter to sing the old songs with." The way she said "when I'm ready" made my stomach clench tight. "Ready for what?" "To go underground and learn the deep songs." She says, "I got the gift. I can hear the mountain humming when it's real quiet at night." I'd started hearing that humming too, a low vibration that seemed to come from the ground itself around midnight. I'd been telling myself it was just the old mine settling, but now I wasn't so sure. Then, last Monday, everything changed when Kayla came home from the woods with something that shouldn't exist. I was fixing a leaky faucet in the kitchen when she walked through the front door, earlier than usual, from her after-school exploring. She had this secretive, excited look on her face, like Christmas morning, and her birthday rolled into one. "How was your day, kiddo?" "Good, Daddy. Real good." She set her backpack carefully on the kitchen table and unzipped it with the kind of focused attention she usually saved for handling baby birds or other precious things. "I made a new friend today." "That's wonderful, baby. Is it someone from school?" But instead of answering, she reached into her backpack and pulled out something that made my heart stop. It was a piece of coal, but not like any coal I'd ever seen in 40 years of living in these mountains. Someone, or something, had carved it into the perfect likeness of a little girl. Every detail was flawless: tiny fingers with lines for knuckles, delicate facial features right down to individual eyelashes, even what looked like braided hair flowing down the back. The surface was polished, smooth as river glass, and when Kayla set it on the table, it seemed to drink in the light from our overhead fixture. "Ain't she the prettiest thing you ever saw, Daddy?" Kayla touched the figure gently, like she was stroking a kitten. "The coal woman made her special for me. Said since I don't have any friends up here in the holler, maybe I'd like to play with this little girl instead." My mouth went dry as sawdust. "Kayla? Honey, I need you to tell me exactly where you got this." "From the coal woman," like I said. "She was waiting by the big white oak that got struck by lightning last spring, just like she promised she would be." Kayla picked up the coal figure and cradled it in both palms. "She's real nice, Daddy. She just looks scary because she's made of mountain coal. But she ain't mean. She's just been waiting a long time for someone who could hear her calling." I stared at this impossible thing, this piece of coal carved with detail that would take a master craftsman weeks to achieve, given to my 7-year-old daughter by someone who looked exactly like the figure from her nightmares. The carving was warm to the touch, like it had been sitting by a fire. "Honey, did you see an actual person in the woods today? A real woman?" Kayla nodded seriously. "She's tall like I drew. Maybe 8 feet or more. Her skin's black like coal, but smooth and shiny, and her hair moves even when there ain't no wind. She talks funny, like her voice comes from way deep underground. But she ain't scary once you get used to looking at her." she just wants someone to talk to after all these years. That night, I tucked Kayla into bed and watched her place the coal figure on her nightstand like it was a beloved doll. "Can she stay in my room, Daddy? She gets lonesome if she's too far from me." Against my better judgment, I said yes. What harm could a piece of carved coal do? Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of voices coming from Kayla's room. At first I thought maybe she'd left her little radio on, but as I got closer to her door, I could make out two distinct voices having a conversation. One was definitely Kayla's sweet, high voice. The other was lower, rougher, like someone talking through a mouth full of gravel and stones. "And in the deep places, we count by sevens instead of tens," the gravelly voice was saying. "7 tunnels, 7 chambers, 7 songs to wake the mountain. Would you like to learn the counting song?" "Yes, ma'am. Will it be hard?" "Not for a bright child like you. You got the blood. I can taste it on the air around you. Mountain blood. Cherokee blood. The old blood that knows how to listen to stone songs." My hands were shaking as I slowly turned the doorknob and pushed the door open just enough to peek inside. Kayla was sitting cross-legged on her bed in her Walmart nightgown, the coal figure held up in front of her face. She was talking to it like it was talking back. But as I watched, I could swear I saw the figure's tiny mouth moving, its microscopic features shifting and changing in the dim light from her Tinkerbell nightlight. "The mountain's been singing to me," I heard Kayla whisper. "Every night when Daddy goes to sleep, I can hear it humming under the ground. That's because you're ready to learn the deep songs, little one. Songs my people sang before the coal companies came and broke the sacred tunnels." I must have made some kind of sound because Kayla suddenly looked toward the door. "Hey, Daddy, we're just talking about mountain music. Who's we, baby?" She held up the coal figure, and I swear to God it looked at me with eyes like tiny red coals. "Me and my coal friend. She was just telling me about the songs her people used to sing in the deep places." The figure was completely still now, just a carved piece of coal in my daughter's hands, but I could feel it watching me, evaluating me, deciding whether I was friend or threat. "It's late, Kayla. Time for sleep." "Yes, sir." She lay down and tucked the figure under her pillow. "Good night, Daddy." I closed her door and stood in the hallway for a long time, listening to the house settle and the wind move through the hollow. But underneath those normal sounds, I could swear I heard that low humming again, like the mountain itself was breathing. The next morning, Mrs. Patterson at the Disperset Elementary School called me at work. "Mr. Thompson, I need to talk to you about Kayla. Today during reading circle, she started speaking in some kind of language I've never heard before. When I asked her what she was saying, she told me she was practicing the old words that her friend was teaching her." "What kind of old words?" "I honestly don't know. They didn't sound like any language I've studied, and I've got a degree in linguistics from UK. It was more like, well, like the sounds rocks might make if they could talk. Very deep, very guttural." And when she wrote some of the words down for me, Mrs. Patterson's voice trailed off. "Mr. Thompson, I've been teaching for 23 years, and I've never seen symbols like what your daughter drew. They're not from any alphabet, I know, and looking at them too long gives me the worst headache." I left work early to pick up Kayla. When I got to the school, Mrs. Patterson showed me the paper Kayla had been writing on. The symbols were like nothing I'd ever seen, angular, twisted shapes that seemed to shift and crawl when I wasn't looking directly at them. Just glancing at them made my eyes water and gave me a headache that felt like ice picks behind my temples. "Kayla, honey, where did you learn to write like this?" "My coal friend taught me," she said as we walked to my old F-150. "She says, it's how mountain people used to write messages in the coal seams before the companies came and dug everything up." Kayla skipped alongside me, completely unconcerned. "She's gonna teach me lots of things, Daddy." She says, "I got the gift because I can hear the stone songs that most folks can't hear no more." That evening, Kayla wouldn't touch her supper. She sat at our little kitchen table, pushing her mac and cheese around with her fork, but wouldn't take a single bite. "I ain't hungry, Daddy. My friend gives me better food in the deep places." "What kind of food?" "Coal, candy, and crystal. Water. Food that makes you strong like the mountain instead of weak like surface food." She pushed her plate away. She says regular food will make me sick now that I'm learning to be a mountain daughter. Around 10 o'clock, I heard footsteps in the basement. Our trailer sits on a foundation with a partial basement where the previous tenants stored coal for an old pot-bellied stove. I'd been meaning to clean it out but hadn't gotten around to it yet. The footsteps were too small and light to be an intruder, so I figured Kayla was sleepwalking again. But when I got down there with a flashlight, what I found made my blood run cold. Kayla was kneeling on the concrete floor next to the old coal bin, eating pieces of coal like they were Christmas candy. Her teeth and lips were stained black, and there was coal dust all down the front of her nightgown. But what made it worse was that she was eating it methodically, almost ritually, like she was following specific instructions. "Kayla," I rushed down the narrow stairs and knelt beside her. "Baby girl, you can't eat that. It'll poison you." She looked up at me with those big brown eyes, now rimmed with coal dust like dark makeup. But instead of looking sick or confused, she looked content, peaceful in a way I hadn't seen since before her mama left. "It tastes like rock candy, Daddy, sweet and crunchy, with little sparkles that pop on your tongue." She held out a piece to me. "My friend says it's mountain candy, the kind Cherokee children used to eat to make them strong enough to hear the stone spirits." I carried her upstairs and made her brush her teeth 4 times, but I couldn't get all the black stains out. She seemed perfectly fine otherwise, not sick or in pain. But no child should be able to chew and swallow actual coal without getting violently ill. Before putting her to bed, I took the coal figure from her room and threw it in the trash can outside, covering it deep under coffee, grounds, and leftover food scraps. The next morning, it was sitting on her nightstand again. "She don't like being thrown away, Daddy," Kayla told me when I found it there. "She says mountain spirits always come back to where they're wanted." Over the next week, I watched my daughter change in ways that made my soul feel cold as January wind. Her skin started getting pale and cool to the touch, like she was slowly turning to stone. When I'd hug her goodnight, she felt less like a warm, living child and more like holding a marble statue. She barely ate anything I cooked, claiming her coal friend was feeding her in the deep places under the mountain, and she started walking in her sleep toward the woods. The first time, I woke up around 3 in the morning to complete silence. Not just quiet, the kind of dead silence that makes your ears ring. I checked Kayla's room and found her bed empty, covers thrown back like she'd left in a hurry. I grabbed my flashlight and ran outside in my underwear and bare feet, calling her name, panic clawing at my chest like a live thing. I found her at the tree line behind our trailer, standing perfectly still in her nightgown, staring into the black woods like she was watching a movie only she could see. "Kayla!" I ran to her and grabbed her shoulders. "What are you doing out here, baby girl?" She turned to look at me, but her eyes were unfocused and distant, like she was still dreaming. "She's calling me, Daddy. She's been waiting so long, and she's getting impatient." Her voice sounded different, deeper, with an echo like she was talking from inside a cave. I carried her back to the house, but it happened again the next night. And the night after that, each time, I'd find her at the exact same spot, staring into the woods like she was waiting for someone to come get her. "She's lonely, Daddy," Kayla told me the next morning when I asked her about it. "She's been waiting for a mountain daughter for more than 100 years. She used to have lots of children to sing with, but they all went away when the coal companies came and broke the sacred places. I took her to Dr. Hensley in town, desperate for some rational explanation. But when they drew blood for tests, the results didn't make any earthly sense. Where there should have been normal levels of vitamins and minerals, Kayla's blood showed concentrations of elements that shouldn't exist in a living person. Iron, carbon, silica, and trace amounts of what the lab tech said looked like actual coal particles. "I've been practicing medicine in these mountains for 30 years, Dr. Hensley told me, frowning at the lab results. "I've never seen blood work like this. According to these numbers, your daughter should be a piece of sedimentary rock, not a 7-year-old child." But I knew there wasn't any mistake. That night, I pretended to be asleep and waited. Sure enough, around midnight, I heard Kayla's door creak open. I gave her a few minutes head start, then followed her outside with my deer rifle and a flashlight. She walked through the hollow like she knew exactly where she was going. Past the other trailers where folks were sleeping, past the old Messer place that's been empty since Tommy's daddy got laid off from the mine. She walked into the woods with the confidence of someone following a familiar path, even though it was darker than the inside of a coal mine and she was barefoot in her thin nightgown. I stayed back far enough that she wouldn't see my light, but close enough that I wouldn't lose her in the thick timber. The woods were dead silent. No night birds, no insects, no small critters moving through the underbrush. Even the wind had stopped. Just the sound of our footsteps on the forest floor, and my own panicked breathing. Kayla led me deeper into the mountains than I'd been since I was a boy, past trees so old and thick that their branches locked together overhead, like the roof of a cathedral. We walked for what felt like hours, climbing steep ridges and following deer paths that seemed to know exactly where they were going. Finally, she stopped in front of something I'd never seen before, even though I'd hunted these woods since I was 12 years old. It was an old mine entrance, but not from any coal company I knew about. The opening was carved into the mountainside like a doorway, surrounded by symbols that looked just like the ones Kayla had been drawing. The entrance was partially hidden behind a rockfall, but there was still a gap big enough for a person to squeeze through. From inside that mine, I could hear children singing, but it wasn't normal children singing. The voices were too deep, too old, harmonizing in ways that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. They were singing in that same strange language Kayla had been speaking, words that seemed to bypass my ears and vibrate directly in my bones. Kayla turned around to face me, and her eyes had changed completely. They were black as coal now, but not empty black. Deep black, like looking into mine shafts that go down forever. "She wants to meet you, Daddy," she said in a voice that sounded like my daughter's voice echoing up from underground. "She wants to thank you for bringing me to her." That's when the coal woman came out of the mine. She unfolded from the darkness like smoke becoming solid, rising up and up until she stood nearly 9 feet tall. She was made entirely of coal and stone, but carved with impossible detail. Every line of muscle, every strand of hair, every fold of the dress that flowed around her like liquid shadow. Her face was beautiful and terrible at the same time, ancient beyond measure, but with eyes that burned like forged coals. When she spoke, her voice was the sound of the mountain itself talking, deep and resonant, and older than anything human. "Your daughter has the blood," she said, reaching toward me with fingers like blackened bone. "Cherokee blood, mountain blood, the old blood that remembers when my people danced in the sacred chambers before the white miners came and sealed the passages with death and greed." Behind her, I could see other shapes moving in the mine entrance, children made of coal and stone and root, their eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. They were singing that haunting song, beckoning for Kayla to join them. "She will be happy in the deep places," the coal woman continued. "She will learn the songs that make mountains grow and the dances that call forth silver streams. She will have playmates who understand the loneliness of being different, being gifted, being able to hear what others cannot hear." The coal woman reached toward me, and I could feel the temperature drop 20 degrees. "Give her to us willingly, and we will give her forever. She will never be lonely, never be hungry, never grow old and die as surface children do." For one terrible moment, I almost did it. Looking at my daughter, pale and fading, getting thinner and stranger every day, part of me thought maybe this ancient thing could give her what I couldn't. Maybe she'd be happier with her own kind, with creatures who understood her gifts. But then Kayla looked at me with those coal-black eyes, and for just a second, I saw my little girl still trapped in there somewhere, scared and calling for her daddy. That's when the survival instinct kicked in, and I did the only thing I could do. I grabbed Kayla and ran. She screamed and fought me like a wildcat, her little fists pounding against my chest, her fingernails leaving scratches that burned like fire. "No, Daddy, I belong here. She's my real family. She understands me." Behind us, the coal woman's voice followed through the trees like rolling thunder. "You cannot take her from us, surface man. She has eaten the mountain's food, breathed the deep air, learned the stone songs. She belongs to us now." I ran through those woods carrying my struggling daughter, crashing through underbrush and stumbling over roots, guided only by moonlight and pure desperation. Somehow, by some miracle, I found our trailer and threw Kayla in my truck despite her screams and tears. We drove south that night, putting 300 miles between us and Harlan County before the sun came up. I didn't stop until we reached my sister Lisa's house in Knoxville, and even then I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see a tall, dark shape following us down the interstate. But distance doesn't matter to something like the coal woman. It's been 3 weeks now, and Kayla is dying. She won't eat anything I give her, says regular food tastes like ash and makes her stomach hurt. She won't sleep except during the day, and even then it's restless, like she's fighting against something trying to pull her back. She sits at Lisa's kitchen window and stares north toward the mountains, her skin getting grayer and more translucent every day. "I can still hear her, Daddy," she whispers sometimes. "She's calling my name in the stone songs, and it hurts not to answer." Lisa thinks I should take her to a psychiatrist, maybe have her committed somewhere they can help her. But I know this isn't something any doctor can fix. This is mountain magic, old as the hills themselves, and it doesn't let go easy. Last night, I woke up to find coal dust footprints leading from the backyard to Kayla's bedroom window. The prints were too big to be human, long and narrow, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. I washed them away with the garden hose, but this morning there were more, and now they circle the entire house. The coal woman has found us, and she's not giving up. Sometimes, in my weakest moments, at 3 in the morning, when I'm watching Kayla waste away to nothing, I think maybe I should drive back to Harlan County and give her what she wants. At least then my daughter would stop suffering. At least then she'd be with her own kind, learning songs I can't teach her, surrounded by friends who understand her gifts. But I know that's not really my thoughts anymore. That's something else whispering in my head, something that wants me to drive north into the mountains where children sing in languages older than English and coal women wait in the deep places for lonely girls to come home. This morning, I found Kayla standing in the backyard at sunrise, staring north with those coal-black eyes. When I touched her shoulder, her skin was cold as January stone. "She's coming, Daddy," she said without looking at me. "Tonight when the moon's dark. She's bringing all her children to sing me home. I've loaded everything we own into the truck again. Tonight, when the sun goes down, we're driving west as far as my credit cards will take us. Maybe California, maybe Alaska. Maybe somewhere so far from the mountains that old songs can't find us. But deep down, I know it won't matter. You can't run from something that lives in the blood. Something that calls to gifts you were born with. The coal woman has been waiting for a mountain daughter for over a century, and now she's found one. And sometimes, late at night when I think Kayla's finally asleep, I can hear that voice like grinding stone, calling across the darkness. Bring her home, surface man. Bring her home where she belongs. I'm starting to think she might be right. Because yesterday, I caught myself humming one of those old songs, and I don't even remember learning the words. I was 28 when I started working road maintenance for the state of West Virginia, and I figured I'd die doing the same job my daddy did before me. That was 7 years ago, before I learned that some debts get passed down through generations, and some work never really ends, no matter how long you've been dead. My name's Marcus Webb, and my family's been in these mountains since before the Civil War. The Webbs worked these hills when they were still logging timber, and we stayed when the coal companies moved in. My great-grandfather died in the mine collapse of 1923. My grandfather lost his lungs to black lung by 50. My daddy managed to get out and work roads instead, figured it was safer above ground. He used to say the mountain had already taken enough Webbs, and maybe road work would break the cycle. He was wrong about that. I grew up hearing stories about the old mines, the way all mountain kids do. How the companies would bring in workers from Wales and Ireland and Poland, men desperate enough to dig coal for wages that barely kept their families fed. How when accidents happened, and they happened regular, the companies would just seal up the tunnels and write off the men inside as acceptable losses. Cost less than a rescue operation, and dead men don't collect paychecks. But the stories my grandmother told were different. She'd sit on the porch in the evenings, smoking her pipe and talking about how sometimes you'd hear the sound of pickaxes coming up from underground, even from mines that had been sealed for decades. How men would go missing near the old mine entrances, especially men who looked like they could swing a tool. She said the mountain never forgot a debt, and the coal companies had left a lot of debts unpaid when they pulled out in the 80s and 90s. I thought they were just stories until I got assigned to Highway 19, the stretch that runs through Brennan County where my great-grandfather died. The state sent me and my partner Jake Morrison out there on a Tuesday in late October. The road had been having problems for months, cracks appearing overnight, sections sinking like the ground underneath was hollow. The engineers figured it was standard subsidence from old mining operations, Nothing we hadn't dealt with before. Just tear up the damaged asphalt, reinforce the foundation, and lay fresh pavement. 3-day job, maybe 4 if the weather didn't cooperate. Jake was good people, couple years older than me, had a wife and twin daughters up in Morgantown. We'd been working together for 2 years, and I trusted him like a brother. He grew up in coal country too, McDowell County, so he understood the mountains the way I did. Both of us had family stories about the mines, and both of us figured we were lucky to be working above ground instead of below it. The damaged section of Highway 19 ran right through what used to be Campbell Ridge Mine. I looked it up in the state archives before we started work. The mine operated from 1919 to 1924. Employed about 60 men at peak production. Closed permanently after a methane explosion killed 14 miners, including my great-grandfather Samuel Webb. The mine was sealed with concrete and steel, and the families of the dead men got $50 each in compensation. $50 for a husband and father. Even in 1924, that was insulting. We set up on Monday during the day shift, got our equipment positioned, and the area marked off with cones and warning signs. The damaged section was about 300 feet long, crisscrossed with cracks that ran deep enough you could drop a quarter down them and never hear it hit bottom. Standard subsidence damage, or so it looked. The asphalt had that rippled appearance you get when the foundation settles unevenly, and in a few places it had actually buckled upward, like something underneath was pushing against it. Monday night, Jake and I decided to switch to the night shift. Highway 19 isn't heavily traveled, but during the day you get enough coal trucks and local traffic that it's easier to work when the road's empty. We both preferred night work anyway. Cooler temperatures, no supervisors checking on us every hour, just the work and the quiet mountains and the sound of equipment. That's when we met the others. We'd been working for about an hour, breaking up the worst sections with jackhammers, when Jake shut off his equipment and called out to me. "Marcus, you hear that?" I killed my own jackhammer and listened. At first, all I could hear was the normal night sounds, insects, wind through the trees, the distant hum of traffic from the interstate. But underneath all that, faint but definitely there, was the sound of men working. The rhythmic clang of metal on rock, the scrape of shovels, voices calling out instructions in accents that sounded foreign but familiar, Welsh, maybe, or Irish. The kind of accents you might have heard in these mountains 100 years ago. Probably echoing from one of the active mines, I said, though I knew that didn't make sense. The nearest working mine was 20 miles south, and sound doesn't carry that far through solid rock. We tried to get back to work, but the underground noise kept getting clearer. Not louder, exactly, but more distinct, like we were moving closer to the source. And then Jake noticed something else. The asphalt under our feet was warm. Not just a little warm from our work lights, but actually hot, like blacktop in the middle of summer. I knelt down and pressed my palm against the surface. The heat went right through my work gloves, hot enough that I had to pull my hand back after a few seconds. "This ain't normal," Jake said, and I could hear the worry in his voice. "Road don't get hot like this from nothing." The heat was spreading outward from the deepest cracks, radiating up through the asphalt like something underneath was warming the ground from below. Within 10 minutes, it was hot enough that we could smell our rubber boot soles starting to soften. The chemical smell of melting rubber mixed with something else, a sulfur odor that made my eyes water and left a bitter taste in my mouth. That's when we heard the first voice. It came up from the cracks in the road, muffled but clear enough to understand. A man's voice, calling out in English with a thick Welsh accent. More cars on the main level. We're behind quota again. Jake and I looked at each other, and I could see my own fear reflected in his face. There shouldn't be anyone underground. The Campbell Ridge mine had been sealed for almost a century. "Marcus," Jake said quietly, "my grandmother used to tell stories about this. About mines where the dead men never stopped working." I wanted to tell him he was being superstitious, but I couldn't make the words come out. Because I was starting to remember my own grandmother's stories, the ones she'd tell on winter nights when the wind howled through the mountains. About mining companies that worked men to death and left their bodies to rot in tunnels. About how the mountain keeps score and debts that don't get forgiven just because you're dead. We tried to radio for backup, but all we got was static filled with voices. Not dispatch voices, old voices, speaking in languages I didn't recognize, mixed with the sound of machinery that hadn't been used in decades. Hand-cranked ventilation fans, steam-powered hoists, the kind of equipment the old mines used before electricity. The crack Jake had been working on started to widen. Not gradually, but all at once, like something underneath was pushing up against the asphalt with tremendous force. It opened up about 2 feet wide and maybe 15 feet long, and light started coming up from inside it. Not electric light, but the orange-red glow of open flame. And the smell that came up from that crack? Jesus Christ, I can still taste it sometimes when I wake up at night. Burning coal and sulfur and something else, something organic that had been cooking in underground heat for decades. "We need to get out of here," I said, backing away from the crack. But Jake was staring down into it, his face lit by the red glow coming up from below. "Marcus," he whispered, "look at this." Against my better judgment, I moved closer and looked down into the crack. What I saw down there will haunt me until the day I die, and probably after that too. Tunnels. A whole network of mine tunnels stretching away into the darkness, lit by torches and oil lamps, like something out of the 19th century. And the tunnels were full of men working with pickaxes and shovels, loading coal cars and pushing them along narrow-gauge tracks. Dozens of men, maybe hundreds, all moving with the steady rhythm of people who'd been doing the same job for years. But something was wrong with every single one of them. Their skin was burned black and hanging in strips off their bones. Some were missing arms or legs, but they kept working anyway, swinging their tools with skeletal hands or lifting coal buckets with arms that were just charred bone. Their work clothes, old-style mining gear with canvas pants and cloth caps, were scorched and smoking, but they wore them like they didn't notice the heat. And their eyes, God help me, their eyes glowed like hot coals in skull sockets, providing their own light in the darkness of the tunnels. As I watched, one of them looked up at us. It had been a man once, I could tell from the shape of the skull and the remains of a thick mustache. But now it was just burned bone and gristle held together by will and some kind of terrible purpose. It studied us for a long moment, then called out to the others, in that same Welsh accent we'd heard before. "New workers up top, fresh backs for the quota." That's when they started climbing toward us. The first one moved like a spider, finding handholds in the tunnel walls with fingers that were mostly bone and sinew. Fast and confident, like it had made this climb 1,000 times before. As it got closer, I could hear it breathing, a wet, labored sound like bellows working, accompanied by the crackle of flames that seemed to burn somewhere inside its chest. "Evening, boys," it said when it reached the edge of the crack. Its voice sounded like grinding coal, rough and dry, and somehow terribly polite. "Name's Thomas Pritchard. Shift foreman for Campbell Ridge Mine, been working this seam since 1919. Jake made a sound like a whimper and started backing toward our truck. I wanted to run too, but I couldn't seem to move. The burned thing pulled itself out of the crack and stood up, brushing dirt off what was left of its mining clothes. Up close, I could see that it was wearing a name tag on its shirt, though the metal was tarnished black and the letters were barely readable. "Don't be afraid, lads," Thomas Pritchard said, and more burned miners were climbing up behind him. "Good, honest work never hurt nobody. Course, we've been a bit short-handed since the explosion, always looking for strong backs, willing to pull their weight. The mine's been closed for 90 years, I managed to say. Thomas laughed, a sound like coal sliding down a chute. "Closed? Son, the mine's never been closed. Just because the company men stopped coming around don't mean the work stopped. Coal don't mine itself, and the mountains got a long memory for debts unpaid." More of them were climbing up now. At least a dozen burned skeletons in mining gear, each one moving with that same spider-like agility. They spread out around the crack like they were starting a work shift, and I could hear others coming up behind them. The sound of dozens of skeletal hands finding purchase on tunnel walls, and voices calling out in Welsh and Irish and Polish. "See, the thing about mining companies," Thomas continued, "is they take what they want and leave when the taking gets dangerous. But the men who die in the tunnels, they can't just pack up and move on to the next job. They stay, and they keep working, because that's what mountain men do. We honor our debts, even if the company men don't honor theirs." Jake finally broke and ran for our truck. I turned to follow him, but the road split open right under our equipment with a sound like breaking thunder. Our truck, a 3-ton Ford with all our gear and materials, dropped into a new crack that opened up like the mountain was swallowing it whole. I could hear the engine still running somewhere deep underground, and then Jake's voice started calling out from the same direction. Not screaming, exactly, but calling for help in a voice that was getting fainter and more distant with every word. "Jake!" I shouted into the crack, but Thomas Pritchard grabbed my shoulder with a hand that felt like it had been pulled out of a furnace. "Your friend's learning the work already," he said. "Mountain folk pick it up quick, it's in the blood." I looked down into the crack where our truck had fallen, and I could see Jake in the tunnels below. He was standing next to one of the coal cars, holding a shovel, his work clothes already starting to smoke from the heat. But his movements were all wrong, too steady, too rhythmic, like he was being controlled by something else. "Jake!" I called again, and he looked up at me. His eyes hadn't started glowing yet, but there was something different about them, something empty and resigned. He mouthed the words, "I can't stop," and went back to shoveling coal. "Don't worry about your friend," Thomas said. "He'll do fine once he gets used to the heat. Most men do, after the first century or so. Now, about you." The other miners had formed a circle around me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from their burned bodies. Each one had been a different person once, different ages, different builds, different nations of origin, but now they were all the same. Burned skeletons in work clothes, eyes glowing with underground fire, moving with the patient determination of men who had eternity to finish their job. "We're not here to hurt you, son," Thomas said. "Just offering honest work for honest pay. The mountain's got coal that needs digging, and we're always looking for men willing to do their share." "What about my family?" I asked. "My wife, my kids?" "Family's important," agreed one of the others, this one with the remains of an Irish accent. "But debt's important too. Your great-grandfather Samuel Webb, he worked this mine for 3 years. Good man, strong back, never missed a shift. Died in the explosion, left his quota unfulfilled." My blood went cold. "How do you know about my great-grandfather?" "We knew Samuel," Thomas said. "Good man, like I said, but when the methane blew, he died, owing the mountain 2 weeks' worth of coal. Interest on that debt's been accumulating for 90 years. Time to settle accounts." The circle of burned miners moved closer, and I could smell my clothes starting to smoke from their body heat. "The coal companies never paid us fair wages," one of them said. "Never gave us proper safety equipment. Never cared when we died in their tunnels. But the mountain cares. The mountain remembers every man who died for coal and every debt that goes unpaid." "Your great-grandfather's debt passes to his son," said another. "And his son's debt passes to his son. That's how it works in coal country. Debts run in families, same as blood." I could feel the heat starting to burn through my work boots, and I knew I had maybe seconds before they dragged me down into those tunnels. But something my grandmother had told me came back. A story about mountain spirits and old agreements, about ways to bargain with things that weren't quite human anymore. "What if I could pay the debt another way?" I asked. Thomas cocked his burned skull to one side, considering. "What you got in mind, son?" "The mining companies," I said, thinking fast. "The ones who left you down there to die. Some of them are still around, still operating. Different names maybe, but same families running them. What if I could bring you the real debt collectors?" The burned miners looked at each other, and I could see something like interest flickering in their coal fire eyes. "Go on," Thomas said. "Give me time," I said. "Let me go back to the surface, do some research. I'll find out which company men are still alive, still profiting from the coal you died for. Bring them here to settle accounts personally." It was a desperate lie, but it was all I had. Thomas studied me for a long moment, and I could hear Jake's voice still calling faintly from the tunnels below, though it was starting to sound less and less like Jake and more like the others. "You got 1 month," Thomas finally said. 1 month to bring us proper payment for the debt. But if you try to run, if you leave these mountains without settling accounts, we'll come for you wherever you are. And we'll take your wife and children too, because family debts run deep in coal country." The burned miners stepped back, and the circle of heat around me eased enough that I could breathe again. 1 month, Thomas repeated. "Don't make us come looking for you, son. You won't like what we do to men who break their word." I ran. Not back toward our truck, That was gone, somewhere deep in the tunnels with Jake, but down Highway 19 toward the nearest town. Behind me, I could hear the cracks in the road sealing up, the asphalt flowing back together like it had never been broken. But I could still hear the sound of mining operations underground, the steady rhythm of pickaxes, and the voices of men calling out in languages that belonged to another century. I ran 8 miles to the Brennan County Sheriff's Office and told them my partner had fallen into a sinkhole. They sent out a search and rescue team, along with state police and emergency services. But when we got back to the location, Highway 19 looked like it had just been freshly paved. No cracks, no heat, no sign that anything had ever been wrong with it. They found our truck 2 days later at the bottom of an old mine shaft 15 miles away. No sign of Jake, and no explanation for how the truck had gotten there. The state police figured he'd driven it there himself, maybe had some kind of breakdown, wandered off into the mountains, and got lost. They searched for 2 weeks before giving up. Jake's wife called me every day for a month, asking if I had any ideas about where he might have gone. I wanted to tell her the truth, but what could I say? That her husband was trapped in a mine that had been sealed for 90 years, working alongside the ghosts of men who died before she was born. That he was probably going to spend eternity shoveling coal in tunnels lit by his own burning bones. I tried to keep my promise to Thomas Pritchard. Spent 3 weeks researching mining company records, trying to find descendants of the men who owned Campbell Ridge Mine. But they were all dead, had been dead for decades, and their companies had been absorbed by larger corporations that had been absorbed by even larger corporations. The chain of ownership was so tangled that even if I could find someone responsible, they'd never believe my story. 2 days before the month was up, I packed my wife and kids into our car and drove to Florida. Told my wife I'd gotten a job offer with a construction company, that we needed to make a fresh start somewhere warm. She didn't ask too many questions. She knew something had happened with Jake's disappearance that I wasn't talking about. We bought a house in Tampa, about as far from coal country as you can get and still be in America. I got work building condominiums on the beach, foundation work in sand instead of rock. No mountains, no mining history, no underground tunnels full of things that used to be men. But you can't really escape family debt, not when it runs as deep as coal seams. They came for me on a Tuesday night in March, exactly 6 months after Jake disappeared. I was working late shift on a hotel construction project, laying foundation supports in the sand. Around 2 a.m., I started hearing familiar voices underground. Welsh accents, Irish brogues, the sound of picks striking rock even though there was nothing but sand for 100 feet down. The sand under my feet started getting warm. I looked up from my work, and Thomas Pritchard was standing at the edge of the construction site, still burned, still wearing his mining clothes, still carrying that pickaxe with the handle worn smooth from a century of use. Behind him were the others, 24 burned miners standing in formation, like a work crew reporting for shift change. "Time's up, son," Thomas said. "Debt's come due." "This is Florida," I said, backing away from them. "No coal mines here, no mountain debts." Thomas smiled, showing teeth like pieces of burnt coal. "Debt follows family, boy. Don't matter if you run to Florida or Alaska or the moon. The mountains got a long reach when it comes to collecting what's owed." The sand split open behind him, revealing mine tunnels that couldn't possibly exist 1,000 miles from West Virginia. But there they were, stretching away into darkness, lit by torches and filled with the sound of men working. And I could see Jake down there, still shoveling, his eyes glowing red now, like all the others. "Your great-grandfather, Samuel Webb, died owing coal to the mountain," Thomas said. "Your grandfather lived his whole life in debt to the mountain. Your father worked roads to avoid the debt. But debt don't disappear just because you change jobs. It accumulates interest, passes to the next generation. You've been living off borrowed time your whole life, son. Time to pay what's owed." They surrounded me, the same way they had in West Virginia, close enough that I could feel my clothes starting to smoke. But this time, there was no bargaining, no month's reprieve. The sand was already hot enough to melt my work boots, and I could hear my wife and children calling my name from somewhere deep in those impossible tunnels. "Please," I said. "My kids don't have anything to do with this." "Kids always pay for their parents' debts," said one of the others. "That's how coal country works. Your boy's already 12 years old, plenty old enough to swing a pick. Your girl's got strong hands, good for loading coal cars. The mountain's been waiting for them, same as it waited for you. That's when I understood. This wasn't about Samuel Webb's unpaid quota from 1924. This was about something bigger, something that went back generations. The Webb family had been working these mountains for over 100 years, and every year we'd taken from the land without giving back what was owed. The mining companies had cheated their workers, but the workers had cheated the mountain, and debts like that don't get forgiven just because time passes. They dragged me down into the tunnels, and I could hear my family already down there, already working. My wife loading coal into carts with movements that weren't quite her own. My children swinging pickaxes with strength they'd never had in life. All of us finally paying the debt that had been accumulating since my great-great-grandfather first struck coal in these mountains. And I realized, as the heat burned away my skin and my eyes started glowing with underground fire, that this was what mountain people do. We work, we honor our debts, and we pass both the work and the debts to our children, because that's how coal country survives. The mine is always hiring. The quota is always behind, and the mountain never forgets a debt, no matter how far you run or how long you wait. If you ever drive through southern West Virginia on Highway 19 and you hear the sound of mining operations underground, don't stop to investigate. Don't get out of your car. And whatever you do, don't let them see that you can hear the work being done. Because if you can hear them, it probably means your family owes the mountain something too. And debts in coal country always come due, sooner or later. The mountain's got time, all the time in the world, and it's always looking for new workers. I'm 38 years old, and for the past 6 years, I've been the only pharmacist in Blackwater Hollow, West Virginia. Population 89 on a good day, though honestly, most folks around here are getting up there in age, and the young people tend to move away as soon as they graduate high school. I ended up here after my divorce got finalized, and I needed somewhere quiet to start over. The pay wasn't much, but the cost of living was nothing, and after 20 years in busy chain pharmacies in Charleston, the idea of a small mountain town where I knew everyone's name sounded like exactly what I needed. The pharmacy sits right on Main Street, which is really just a 2-lane road that winds through the valley between 2 ridges. It's one of those old buildings from the 1942s, with the original tin ceiling tiles and hardwood floors that creak no matter how carefully you walk. Mrs. Henderson, who owned it before me, had kept everything exactly the way it was when her husband built it after the war. The prescription counter, the wooden shelves, even the old-fashioned cash register that still had the satisfying ching when you hit the total button. I kept it all the same because it felt right, and because most of my customers had been coming here for decades. Most days were pretty routine. My customers were mainly elderly coal miners, dealing with black lung and chronic pain from decades underground, plus their wives who'd been taking care of everybody else their whole lives and finally needed some care themselves. I knew everyone's medications by heart, knew who was struggling to pay for their prescriptions, knew whose granddaughter was getting married next month. It was the kind of place where people still paid with exact change counted out from little coin purses, and where I kept a running tab for families going through rough patches. The work wasn't challenging in the way my old job had been, but it was satisfying in a different way. These people depended on me, and I took that seriously. I'd drive medications up the mountain roads to folks who couldn't make it down to town, and I kept a close eye on anyone whose health was declining. Dr. Morrison, who ran the little clinic next door, would send people over with handwritten prescriptions, and we'd worked out a good system for making sure everyone got what they needed. Looking back now, I think that's why what happened hit me so hard. I'd gotten comfortable with the routine, with knowing exactly what to expect each day. Tuesday through Saturday, 9 to 6, same faces, same conversations about the weather and whose vegetables were coming in good this year. Sundays and Mondays, I'd drive down to Beckley to pick up supplies and visit the regional library to use their internet, since the connection up in Blackwater Hollow was still pretty spotty. It was a Tuesday morning in early October when everything started. The leaves were just beginning to turn, and there was that crisp smell in the air that made you want to drink hot coffee and wear flannel shirts. I'd opened up at 9 like always, started the coffee pot, and was going through the previous day's invoices when the bell above the door chimed. I looked up expecting to see Mr. Garrett coming in for his heart medication, or maybe Mrs. Phillips picking up something for her arthritis. But instead, there was a woman I'd never seen before. That was unusual enough in itself. I knew everyone in Blackwater Hollow, and we didn't get many visitors except for the occasional hiker who'd taken a wrong turn somewhere up on the ridge trail. She was probably in her 60s, wearing a dark blue dress that looked like it had been well cared for, but was older than current fashion. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she carried herself with the kind of posture that suggested she'd been someone important once upon a time. What struck me most, though, were her eyes. They had this look in them like she was carrying around some kind of terrible sadness, the way people look at funerals when they're trying to hold themselves together. "Good morning," I said, putting on my customer service smile. "What can I help you with today?" She reached into her purse and pulled out what looked like a folded piece of paper. When she handed it to me, I could tell immediately that something was off. The paper felt different, thicker, with a texture I wasn't used to, and it was yellowed around the edges like old documents get when they've been sitting in attics for decades. I unfolded it carefully and saw that it was a prescription, but unlike any I'd ever seen. The writing was done in fountain pen ink, the kind that was deep black and had slightly uneven lines. At the top, it said Dr. William Henley, General Practice in formal lettering, followed by an address in Blackwater Hollow that I didn't recognize. The medication listed was something called temporal stabilizer with dosage instructions, written in the same careful handwriting. Take 1 tablet daily until time coheres properly. Below that was a signature that looked official enough, though the ink had faded somewhat. I read it twice, then looked up at the woman. "Ma'am, I'm not familiar with this medication. Is this a brand name I might not know, or maybe something that goes by a different generic name?" She just smiled, but it was one of the saddest smiles I'd ever seen. "Dr. Henley wrote this in 1953, she said quietly, "right before the accident that broke time." I felt a little uncomfortable laugh escape. "I'm sorry, but I think there might be some confusion here. This prescription appears to be quite old, and I'm not sure." "I understand," she interrupted gently. "You can't fill it right now because you don't understand what it's for. I'll come back when you do." Before I could ask what she meant, she turned and walked toward the door. I called after her. "Wait, what's your name? At least, let me take down your contact information so I can call you when I figure this out." But she just shook her head and kept walking. The door chimed as she left, and I watched through the window as she walked down Main Street and turned the corner by the old Baptist church. I stood there, holding the prescription, feeling confused and oddly unsettled. The first thing I did was look up Dr. William Henley. It took some digging through old records and a call to the County Historical Society, but I eventually found him. He had indeed been a doctor in Blackwater Hollow, and he had died in 1953, not from natural causes, though. He'd been killed in a mining explosion at the old Consolidated Coal operation about 5 miles up the valley. The newspaper article I found online said 47 men had died in that blast, including Dr. Henley, who'd been down in the mine that day checking on an injured worker. It was described as one of the worst industrial accidents in the county's history, and it had effectively ended coal mining in Blackwater Hollow. The mine had been sealed up after the explosion and never reopened. I printed out the article and read it several times, trying to make sense of what the woman had told me. The dates matched up. The prescription was dated about a week before the explosion happened. But that didn't explain what she'd meant about the accident breaking time or why she needed medication for something that had happened 70 years ago. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I lived in a small apartment above the pharmacy, so I kept going downstairs to look at the prescription again. Each time, it seemed to become more unsettling. The paper felt older than it should, and the ink looked like it had been written recently, despite the faded appearance around the edges. I started researching the mining accident more thoroughly, using the better internet connection at the library in Beckley during my next supply run. What I found made me more confused, not less. The details of the accident seemed to change depending on which source I was looking at. One newspaper report said it happened on October 15th, 1953. Another said October 15th, 1967. A mining safety report I found listed the date as October 15th, 1981. At first, I thought it was just sloppy, record-keeping, or scanning errors, but the more I dug, the more variations I found. The number of dead changed too, sometimes 47, sometimes 49, sometimes 51. The names were different, in different accounts, though Dr. William Henley appeared in all of them. When I called the local historical society to ask about the discrepancies, the elderly woman who answered the phone said something that made my skin crawl. "Oh, the mine explosion," she said matter-of-factly. "Yes, that happens every 20 years or so. Always on October 15th. Always takes about the same number of men. Been going on since the mine opened, far as anyone can remember." "What do you mean it happens every 20 years?" I asked. "The mine's been sealed since 1953. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Is it?" she said finally. "I could have sworn I heard the sirens just a few years back. Maybe I'm getting confused. Sorry, honey, my memory isn't what it used to be." She hung up before I could ask any more questions. The next morning, Wednesday, I was still thinking about the phone call when the door chime rang again. This time, it was a middle-aged man in work clothes, carrying what looked like another old prescription. "Morning," he said, setting the paper on the counter. "Need to get this filled." It was written on the same type of yellowed paper, in the same fountain pen ink. Same doctor's name and address, same medication, temporal stabilizer. But this prescription was dated 1967, 2 weeks after the mining accident that had supposedly happened that year. Before I could say anything, the door chimed again. An elderly woman came in with another prescription. Then a younger man, maybe in his 30s. Then a teenage girl who looked nervous and kept glancing back at the door. All of them had prescriptions for temporal stabilizer. All written by Dr. Henley. All dated from different decades, but always a week or two after October 15th of whatever year was written at the top. "I can't fill these," I told them. "This medication doesn't exist, and this doctor died decades ago." The middle-aged man looked at me with the same sad expression the first woman had worn. "He writes them after every accident," he said quietly. "Always hopes maybe this time someone will know how to make it stop." "Make what stop?" "The dying," said the elderly woman. "Same 47 men, over and over. Same explosion, same day. Some of us remember it from when we were young. Some of us remember it from when we were older. Some of us remember being in it ourselves." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "That's impossible." The teenage girl stepped forward. "My grandfather died in that explosion in 1953, she said. "My father died in it in 1973. Last time it happened, in 1993, I lost my brother. I'm hoping maybe this time." She gestured helplessly at the prescription in her hand. I stared at all of them, trying to process what they were telling me. "You're saying the same mining accident happens every 20 years? The exact same accident?" "Not exactly the same," the younger man said. "Different faces sometimes, different families, but always October 15th, always 47 men, always Dr. Henley down there trying to help, and always getting caught when the mountain comes down." They left their prescriptions on the counter and filed out quietly, leaving me alone with a pile of impossible documents. I spent the rest of the day staring at them, trying to find some rational explanation. Maybe it was some kind of elaborate prank, or maybe there was a chemical leak somewhere that was making people hallucinate shared delusions. But deep down, I was starting to believe them. That night, I started seeing things. It began as shadows in my peripheral vision, quick movements that disappeared when I turned to look directly. At first, I thought it was just my eyes adjusting to the dim lighting in the old building, but the shadows seemed too purposeful, too human-shaped. Then I started hearing voices. They were muffled, like conversations happening in the next room, but when I went to check, there was never anyone there. I could make out individual words sometimes. Help, trapped, can't breathe, please. Always men's voices, always urgent and frightened. By Thursday morning, the smell hit me. Coal dust and smoke, thick and acrid like something was burning nearby. I checked every corner of the building, looked for electrical problems, even went outside to see if there was a fire somewhere up in the hills. But the smell was strongest inside the pharmacy, especially near the prescription counter where all those impossible prescriptions were still sitting. More people came in Thursday with more prescriptions. Old people, young people, even some I recognized from around town who'd never mentioned anything strange before. They all wanted temporal stabilizer, and they all had the same resigned, hopeful expression when they asked if I'd figured out how to make it yet. "What exactly do you think this medication would do?" I asked one of them, a man about my age who worked at the post office. "Fix it," he said simply. "Make time work right again. Stop the loop." "What loop?" He looked at me like I was being deliberately obtuse. "The time loop. The one that caught the mine, caught the town, caught all of us. October 15th keeps coming back, and those men keep dying, and we keep watching it happen." That afternoon, I decided to drive up to where the old mine had been. I'd lived here for 6 years, but had never actually seen it. The access road was blocked off, and most people said it wasn't safe to go poking around old mining sites. The road was worse than I'd expected, just 2 ruts through the trees with grass growing up the middle. My car scraped bottom several times, and I was starting to think I'd have to turn back when I finally came to a cleared area with the remains of some old industrial buildings. The mine entrance itself was sealed with concrete, just like the records had said. But standing there looking at it, I could feel something wrong in the air. It was too quiet. No birds, no insects, no wind. The silence was so complete it made my ears ring. And then I heard the explosion. It wasn't loud, not like I'd expected. More like a deep rumble coming from somewhere far underground, followed by the sound of men shouting. I spun around, looking for the source. But there was nothing to see, except the sealed mine entrance and the empty forest. The shouting got louder. I could hear individual voices now, calling for help, crying out in pain and fear. Someone was yelling orders, trying to organize a rescue. Someone else was calling for Dr. Henley. I ran back to my car and drove away as fast as the rough road would allow, but I could hear the voices until I reached the main highway. Friday morning, the shadows in the pharmacy were solid enough that I couldn't dismiss them anymore. I watched men in mining clothes walk through my store, their faces blackened with coal dust, their eyes wide with panic. They moved like they were underwater, slow and struggling, reaching out for help that never came. They couldn't see me, but I could see them clearly now. Some were young, barely out of their teens. Some were older, grandfathers who'd probably been mining since they were children. All of them were afraid, and all of them were looking for a way out that didn't exist. The smell of smoke and coal dust was so thick I could barely breathe. I tried to open windows, tried to air out the building, but it didn't help. The smell was coming from wherever these men were trapped, and that place existed in the same space as my pharmacy, but in a different time. Dr. Henley appeared Friday afternoon. I was sitting behind the prescription counter, trying to ignore the ghostly miners wandering through my store, when I felt someone watching me. I looked up and there was a man in a dark suit, carrying an old-fashioned medical bag. He was more solid than the others, more present. "You're the pharmacist," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "I've been writing prescriptions," he continued, hoping someone would understand, hoping someone would know how to make what I need. "Temporal stabilizer isn't real," I managed to say. "No," he agreed sadly, "but it should be. Time broke when the mountain came down, fractured like glass. The moment keeps repeating, and we can't move past it. Those men keep dying, and I keep failing to save them." "Why me?" I asked. "Why is this happening to me?" Dr. Henley looked around at the shadows of dying men filling my pharmacy. "Because you're here," he said simply. "Because someone needs to witness it. Someone needs to remember that it matters, even if we can't fix it." He turned to leave, then looked back. "October 15th is Monday," he said. "You should leave town." But when Monday came, I couldn't leave. I'd tried. I'd packed everything I could fit in my car Sunday night, planning to drive down to Charleston and figure out what to do from there. But every road out of Blackwater Hollow led back to the pharmacy. I'd drive for what felt like hours, following routes I'd taken dozens of times before, only to find myself pulling up in front of the old building again. The loop had caught me too. Monday morning, I unlocked the pharmacy at 9 o'clock like always, made coffee like always, and waited. The ghostly miners were everywhere now, solid as real people, their panic and desperation filling the air like smoke. I could hear them talking to each other, trying to find a way out, calling for help that would never come. At exactly 3:47 p.m., The explosion shook the building. Even though I was 5 miles away from the mine, I felt it like an earthquake. Windows rattled, bottles fell off shelves, and the floor rolled under my feet. In that moment, I could see everything that was happening underground: the cave-in, the crushing weight of stone and earth, the men trapped in pockets of poisoned air. And I understood why Dr. Henley kept writing prescriptions for medicine that didn't exist. Some things are too broken to fix, but too important to stop trying to fix. Tuesday morning, the first woman came back. She looked exactly the same as before, wearing the same blue dress, carrying the same sad expression. "Have you figured it out yet?" she asked, setting her prescription on the counter. I looked down at the yellowed paper, then back at her face. "There is no temporal stabilizer," I said quietly. "There never will be. Time isn't broken. This is just how it works sometimes. Some moments are too heavy to move past." She nodded like she'd been expecting this answer. "Will you try anyway?" I thought about it for a long time. About the 47 men who would die again in 20 years, and the families who would lose them again, and Dr. Henley, who would fail to save them again. About the weight of witnessing something terrible and being unable to stop it. "I'll try," I said finally. She smiled, still sad but with a little hope in it now. "Thank you. I'm still here in Blackwater Hollow. Still the only pharmacist in a town of 89 people. Every morning I unlock the pharmacy, make coffee, and wait for people to bring me prescriptions I can't fill for medicine that doesn't exist. But I keep trying to fill them anyway." Looking back now, I understand that some prescriptions aren't really about the medicine. They're about hope. About the human need to believe that even the most broken things might someday be fixed. Dr. Henley knew he couldn't save those men. But he kept trying because someone has to try. Someone has to care enough to write the prescription, even if it can never be filled. I've gotten used to the shadows and the voices. I've learned to work around the ghostly miners who wander through my store, still looking for a way out after all these years. Sometimes I talk to Dr. Henley when he appears, and we discuss different formulations for temporal stabilizer, even though we both know it's impossible. The next October 15th is still months away, but I'm not planning to leave. Someone needs to be here to witness it, to remember it, to care that it happens. Someone needs to keep trying to fill the prescriptions, even when, especially when, they can't be filled. Because that's what hope looks like sometimes. Not the belief that things will get better, but the decision to keep trying anyway. I still don't know if that makes me a good pharmacist or just a stubborn one. But every morning when I turn on that old cash register and hear its satisfying ching, I think about Dr. Henley and his impossible prescriptions, and I know I'm in the right place. Some medicines heal the body, others heal the spirit, and sometimes the act of trying to create medicine that doesn't exist is the most healing thing of all. I'm 51 years old, and I've been working as a forest ranger in the Daniel Boone National Forest for over 20 years now. Started right out of college when I was young and stupid enough to think I could save the world one trail at a time. My name's Carl, and honestly, after 2 decades of dealing with everything from bear encounters to lost hikers to the occasional meth lab hidden back in the hollers, I figured I'd seen it all. The Kentucky mountains don't surprise me much anymore, or at least they didn't until last month. I've got a section of the forest that's mine to maintain. About 40 square miles of some of the most remote wilderness left in eastern Kentucky. Most folks stick to the main trails, the ones that lead to waterfalls and scenic overlooks where they can take their Instagram photos and feel like they've conquered nature. But my real work happens on the old trails, the forgotten ones that snake back into places where the sun barely touches the ground even in summer. Places with names like Widow's Ridge and Devil's Backbone. Names that make tourists nervous but are just part of the landscape to me. The job suits me fine. I live alone in a small cabin about 10 miles from the nearest town, which is barely big enough to have a post office and a gas station. Never married, though I came close once. Sarah and I dated for 3 years, before she decided she couldn't handle dating a man who disappeared into the mountains for days at a time. Can't say I blame her. This isn't the kind of life that works well with relationships, but it's the life I chose. My parents died young, dad from black lung, mom from cancer, and the mountains were about the only family I had left. Most of my days are pretty routine. I wake up before dawn, check the weather reports, load my truck with whatever gear I need, and head out to whichever section needs attention. Could be clearing fallen trees after a storm, checking trail markers, maintaining shelters, or just doing general wellness checks on areas that haven't seen human activity in months. I carry a radio, GPS, first aid kit, chainsaw when I need it, and enough supplies to spend a night or two in the woods if something goes wrong. After 20 years, you learn to be prepared for just about anything. The Daniel Boone Forest covers over 700,000 acres across 21 counties in Kentucky, but my section is special. It includes some of the oldest growth forest left in the state, trees that were here when Daniel Boone himself was wandering these ridges. There are Cherokee burial sites scattered throughout the area, most of them unmarked and protected by federal law. The whole region has this weight to it, this sense of history that goes back way further than the mining camps and logging operations that most people think of when they picture Appalachia. I've always felt comfortable in these woods. Even as a kid growing up in Hazard, I'd rather spend my weekends hiking the old coal company roads than hanging around town. The mountains have their own rhythm, their own rules, and once you learn to read the signs, which way the wind blows before a storm, how to tell fresh bear scat from old, where to find water when the creeks run dry, they'll take care of you. Or at least, that's what I always believed. Widow's Ridge got its name from a tragedy back in the 1800s when a late spring blizzard caught a group of families trying to reach the valley before winter set in. The men went ahead to break trail and never came back. The women and children waited for 3 days before they froze to death. Local legend says you can still hear them calling for their husbands on quiet nights, but I've spent plenty of nights up there and never heard anything more supernatural than screech owls and coyotes. The ridge runs for about 8 miles along the eastern edge of my territory, following an old Cherokee hunting trail that later became a logging road. Most of it's grown over now, barely wide enough for my truck in some places. But it connects to a network of hiking trails that serious backpackers use to access some of the more remote camping areas. I make it up there maybe once a month during the warm season, less often in winter when the road becomes impassable. Last month was different, though. We'd had a series of bad storms come through in early October, and I was getting reports from hikers about multiple trees down across the main trail on Widow's Ridge. Nothing unusual about that. Storms knock down trees, I go clear them. It's part of the job. But when I called headquarters to let them know I'd be spending a couple days up there with the chainsaw, dispatch told me something that made me pause. "Carl, you might want to know we've had some weird reports coming out of that area," Jenny said. Jenny's been working dispatch for almost as long as I've been ranging, and she's not the type to get spooked easily. Nothing official, just some hikers calling in about strange sounds and arrangements. Arrangements? That's what they called them. Said they found what looked like sculptures made out of bones, arranged in patterns. Probably just kids messing around or maybe some kind of art project, but figured you should know. I told her I'd check it out, but I wasn't particularly concerned. Every few years, some college kid or wannabe artist decides the forest is their personal gallery and starts leaving installations around. Usually harmless, though we have to remove them because they're not supposed to be there. Federal land has strict rules about that kind of thing. I loaded up the truck early on a Tuesday morning in late October. The weather was perfect for working outdoors, cool and crisp, with that particular quality of autumn air that makes you feel like you could hike forever. The leaves were past peak but still hanging on, creating this golden canopy that filtered the sunlight into something almost magical. Days like that are why I love this job, why I never seriously considered Jenny's suggestion a few years back that I transfer to a desk position at the regional office. The drive up to Widow's Ridge takes about 45 minutes from my cabin, the last 15 on increasingly rough Forest Service roads that most people wouldn't attempt without four-wheel drive. I know every pothole and washout on that route, every place where the road narrows to barely one lane and you have to hope you don't meet someone coming the other way. About halfway up, I started noticing something odd. The forest was quiet, not just normal quiet, but completely silent. No bird calls, no squirrels chattering, no insects buzzing. After 20 years in these woods, you develop a sense for the normal soundtrack of the mountains. There should have been sounds, especially on such a beautiful morning. But there was nothing except the rumble of my truck engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. I pulled over at one of the wider spots and shut off the engine, thinking maybe the noise was scaring everything away. But even sitting there in complete silence, I didn't hear anything. No wind in the trees, no distant bird calls, nothing. The silence felt thick, almost oppressive, like the air itself was holding its breath. Looking back now, I should have trusted my instincts and turned around right then. 20 years in the woods teaches you to pay attention when something feels wrong, even if you can't put your finger on what it is. But I had a job to do, trees to clear, and I'd never been one to let weird feelings keep me from my responsibilities. I started the truck back up and continued toward the ridge, telling myself the wildlife was probably just spooked by the recent storms. Sometimes, after severe weather, it takes a few days for the normal patterns to return. Animals hole up, wait for things to settle down. It made sense, or at least enough sense that I could push the uneasiness to the back of my mind. The main trail access for Widow's Ridge is marked by an old wooden sign that's been there since before I started working this section. The parking area is just a wide spot in the road where maybe 3 or 4 cars can pull off, surrounded by massive oak and hickory trees that have to be at least a century old. I parked the truck, loaded my pack with the chainsaw and gear, and started up the trail. The first quarter mile was normal enough. I could see where the storms had done their damage, branches scattered across the path, a few smaller trees knocked over, the usual aftermath of high winds and heavy rain. But as I got deeper into the forest, that oppressive silence continued. It was like walking through a photograph, everything perfectly still and lifeless. That's when I found the first sculpture. I almost walked past it without noticing, my attention focused on a large oak that had fallen across the trail about a quarter mile ahead. But something in my peripheral vision made me stop and look to my left, into a small clearing maybe 30 feet off the main path. At first, I couldn't quite process what I was seeing. It looked like a tower of some kind, maybe 8 feet tall, perfectly balanced in the center of the clearing. But as I got closer, I realized it was made entirely of bones. Animal bones, arranged in a complex spiral pattern that somehow managed to stay upright without any visible support. The bones were clean and white, bleached by sun and weather, but they weren't old. Some of them looked fresh, like they'd been cleaned recently. I could identify deer ribs, what looked like bear femurs, smaller bones that might have come from raccoons or possums, all of them arranged with an almost mathematical precision, each piece positioned to support the next in a way that defied everything I knew about physics and engineering. I'm not easily impressed by much, but I have to admit, this thing was beautiful in a disturbing kind of way. Whoever had built it understood balance and symmetry in ways that most people never grasp. It was art, no question about it, but it was also something else, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I walked around the sculpture, trying to figure out how it stayed upright. There was no central support, no hidden wires or brackets. The bones were simply balanced against each other with perfect precision, as if gravity worked differently in that particular spot. I touched one of the lower ribs gently, and the entire structure swayed slightly but didn't fall. That's when I noticed I wasn't alone in the clearing. There were more sculptures hidden among the trees, each one as impossible and beautiful as the first. I counted them as I moved through the clearing, 7, 8, 12, 15. They formed a rough circle around a massive oak tree that had to be one of the oldest in the forest, its trunk so wide that it would take 4 or 5 people holding hands to reach around it. All of the sculptures were made from different combinations of bones, but they shared that same impossible balance, that same mathematical perfection. Some were tall and spiral-shaped, others were more complex, geometric forms that hurt to look at directly. A few incorporated skulls, deer, bear, what looked like a mountain lion, positioned as if they were watching something. I pulled out my phone to take pictures, figuring I'd need documentation for my report. But when I looked at the screen, the camera showed normal forest where the sculptures should have been. Just trees and undergrowth, no bone towers, no mysterious art installations. I tried several different angles, even walking up close to one of the sculptures and holding the phone inches away from it. The camera saw nothing. That's when my radio started acting up. I'd been trying to call headquarters since I first saw the sculptures, but instead of Jenny's voice, all I got was clicking sounds. Not static or interference, actual clicking, like someone tapping bones together in a rhythmic pattern. I checked the frequency, tried different channels, even switched the radio off and on again. Same clicking on every channel. I was starting to feel genuinely unsettled, which isn't something that happens to me often. I've dealt with my share of weird situations over the years. Everything from drug dealers with automatic weapons to hikers who swore they'd seen Bigfoot, but this felt different. The silence, the impossible sculptures, the technology failures, it all added up to something that my 20 years of experience couldn't explain. I decided to finish documenting what I could see and get back to the truck. Whatever was going on here, it was beyond the scope of a simple maintenance call. I'd file a report, let the office decide how to handle it. Maybe bring a team back with better equipment, or contact some university researchers who might be interested in studying the sculptures. But as I was preparing to leave the clearing, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a new sculpture that hadn't been there when I arrived. This one was positioned about 20 feet from where I was standing, and it was different from the others in a fundamental way. It was made from human bones. I've seen enough human remains in my career to recognize them immediately. Ribs, femurs, arm bones, a collection of skulls arranged in a twisted spiral that reached nearly 10 feet into the air. The skulls were from different time periods. Some looked ancient, weathered by decades or centuries of exposure, while others appeared much more recent. My training kicked in immediately. Human remains in the forest could mean anything from old Native American burial sites to recent murder victims. Either way, it was far beyond my authority to handle alone. I needed to secure the scene and get law enforcement involved immediately. But as I was backing away from the human bone sculpture, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around slowly, my hand moving automatically to the bear spray on my belt. What I saw standing at the edge of the clearing shouldn't have been possible, but there it was. It was 12 feet tall, made entirely of bones, held together by what looked like dried sinew and moss. But unlike the sculptures, this thing was moving. It walked like a marionette, each step accompanied by the sound of bones clicking against each other, ancient joints grinding in ways that human joints were never meant to move. Where its head should have been was a collection of animal skulls, deer, bear, smaller creatures, all facing different directions, creating this horrible crown of empty eye sockets that seemed to be looking everywhere at once. Its arms were made from arm bones, fingers that were actual finger bones, everything wrong and impossible but undeniably real. It was carrying an armload of fresh bones, some of them still dripping, and as I watched in frozen horror, it began adding them to one of the nearby sculptures with the careful precision of an artist perfecting their masterpiece. The thing noticed me watching and tilted its cluster of skulls in my direction, studying me with the intensity of a scientist examining an interesting specimen. I've been stared at by bears, mountain lions, even a few people with violent intentions, but nothing had ever looked at me the way this thing did. It wasn't seeing me as a threat or prey or obstacle. It was seeing me as raw material. It reached out with those impossible arms, fingers of bone clicking together as it gestured toward me. Then it started making sounds, not words, but the unmistakable noise bones make when they're being deliberately broken. Snap, crack, splinter. Over and over, like it was trying to communicate something specific. I realized, with a clarity that cut through my terror, that it was showing me how it wanted to arrange my skeleton. It pointed to a gap in its circle of sculptures, a space that was exactly the right size for a human-shaped bone arrangement. It had been waiting for me, or someone like me, to complete its collection. That's when my paralysis broke. I turned and ran through the forest like my life depended on it, which I was pretty sure it did. Behind me, I could hear the thing following, moving with that horrible clicking, rattling sound of bones falling apart and rebuilding themselves with each step. Every time I looked back, and I couldn't help looking back, the thing was there, sometimes running on 2 legs, sometimes on 4, sometimes seeming to flow between the trees like liquid bone. It was rebuilding itself as it moved, picking up sticks and rocks and dead animals from the forest floor and incorporating them into its body, becoming something new and even more impossible with each passing moment. It chased me for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, leaving a trail of scattered bones and forest debris behind it. The sound it made was like nothing I'd ever heard, the rattle of a skeleton falling down stairs, but continuous and purposeful. Sometimes it would get close enough that I could hear individual bones clicking against the trees as it passed. I've always been in decent shape for a man my age, but terror is a hell of a motivator. I ran harder and faster than I had since high school, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs with the kind of reckless desperation that comes from knowing that stopping means death. Finally, I reached my truck. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. As the engine started, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw the thing standing among the trees at the edge of the parking area, its skull cluster tilted as if it was memorizing my license plate. Even as I drove away, spinning gravel and probably doing damage to my transmission in my haste to get out of there, I could see it in my mirror. It was already starting a new sculpture, arranging the bones and debris it had collected during our chase into another impossible tower. I drove straight to the ranger station and filed an incident report, but I described it as possible poaching activity and human remains discovered on federal land. I didn't mention the bone creature or the impossible sculptures. I'm not stupid. I know how reports like that get filed, and I had 20 years of credibility to protect. 3 days later, a team of rangers and federal investigators went up to Widow's Ridge to examine the scene. They found normal forest. No bone sculptures, no human remains, no evidence that anything unusual had ever happened there. According to their report, the area showed typical storm damage, but nothing requiring further investigation. But 3 weeks after my encounter, hikers started going missing on Widow's Ridge. Not all at once, one every few days, always solo hikers or people who had separated from their groups. Search teams would find their gear scattered around the forest, sometimes their clothes arranged in what the reports described as artistic patterns, but never the people themselves. The official explanation is that the area has become attractive to bears preparing for winter hibernation, and that people are being warned to avoid hiking alone in that section. But I know what's really happening up there. I know what those artistic patterns really are. I've thought about going back, maybe with a team of people who might believe me, but I can't bring myself to do it. I've transferred to a different section of the forest, one that's closer to civilization and gets more regular traffic. I tell people it's because I wanted a change of scenery after 20 years, and most of them seem to accept that explanation. But the truth is, I'm scared. Not just of the thing I saw, but of what it might have learned about me during those few minutes when it was studying me so carefully. Sometimes, late at night in my cabin, I hear clicking sounds in the forest outside my windows. Not quite random, but not quite a pattern either. Like something practicing. I still work in the Daniel Boone Forest, but I've never gone back to Widow's Ridge. And if you're planning to hike in that area, I'd strongly suggest you choose somewhere else. The mountains are full of beautiful trails that don't come with the risk of becoming someone's art project. To this day, I can't explain what I saw up there, but I know it was real, and I know it's still there, somewhere among those ancient trees, patiently arranging its sculptures and waiting for the next visitor to complete its collection. Some things in these mountains are older than human understanding, older than our maps and regulations and scientific explanations, and some things are better left alone. I'm 43 years old, and up until last month, I was the principal at Pine Ridge Elementary School in eastern Tennessee. I'd held that position for 8 years, and honestly, it was the kind of job that made you feel like you were making a real difference. Good school, good kids, families that cared about education even if they didn't have much money. The kind of place where you knew every student's name and their parents' names too. I thought I'd retire from that job someday, maybe get a little plaque on the wall thanking me for my service to the community. I was wrong about a lot of things, it turns out. Pine Ridge sits in a valley between two ridges of the Appalachian Mountains, about 40 minutes from the nearest real town. It's the kind of place that got left behind when the coal industry dried up. But the families that stayed have deep roots. Some of them have been in these mountains since before Tennessee was even a state. The school serves about 200 kids from kindergarten through 5th grade, and most days, the biggest problem I had to deal with was making sure the ancient heating system kept working through the winter. I grew up in Knoxville, went to college there, got my education degree, and worked in the city schools for a few years. But when the position opened up at Pine Ridge, something about it called to me. Maybe it was the idea of being somewhere that felt more like a real community, where you weren't just another face in the crowd. My husband thought I was crazy to take a pay cut to work in what he called the middle of nowhere, but I loved it from the first day. The building itself is old, built in the 1952 when the mining company was still operating and there were more families in the area. Red brick, 2 stories, with those big windows that let in plenty of natural light. We've got a small playground out back and a little garden where the 3rd graders grow vegetables every spring. The whole place has that comfortable, lived-in feeling that you can't fake in newer buildings. Most of our families have been in the area for generations. The Hendersons, the Coopers, the Matthews. Their grandparents and great-grandparents all went to the same school, back when it was just one room with a wood stove. There's a real sense of continuity here, of being part of something bigger than yourself. At least, that's what I used to think. The trouble started last October, right after we came back from fall break. That's when we got our first new enrollment in almost 2 years. Emma Fairchild, 8 years old, 2nd grade. Her parents came in on a Monday morning with all the paperwork filled out perfectly, politely asking to enroll their daughter. They were different right from the start. Mr. and Mrs. Fairchild were probably in their 30s, though it was hard to tell exactly. They had that pale, almost translucent skin you sometimes see in people who spend a lot of time indoors, and they spoke in this formal, old-fashioned way that made me think of how people talked in old movies. Very proper, very polite, but with this underlying stiffness that seemed unnatural. When I asked where they'd moved from, they said simply, "Up the mountain," and didn't elaborate. Emma herself was a beautiful child, dark hair, serious gray eyes, and incredibly well-behaved. She sat quietly in the chair next to my desk while her parents handled the enrollment, hands folded in her lap, not fidgeting or asking to look at things like most 8-year-olds would. When I spoke to her directly, she answered in complete sentences with perfect grammar, no, yeah, or uh-huh. It was yes ma'am and no ma'am every time. The paperwork seemed to be in order: birth certificate, immunization records, previous school transcripts. Though interestingly, the transcripts showed she'd been homeschooled for the past 2 years. When I asked why they were enrolling her now, Mrs. Fairchild said they felt it was time for Emma to have more social interaction with children her age. Made perfect sense. But right from Emma's first day, something felt off. She was incredibly bright, probably the smartest 2nd grader I'd ever encountered. Her reading level was easily that of a 5th or 6th grader, and her writing was not just advanced but had this oddly mature quality to it. When Mrs. Patterson, her teacher, assigned the class to write about their families, Emma turned in a 2-page essay about life in the mountains that read like it was written by an adult. More unsettling was what she seemed to know about the local area. During a social studies lesson about community history, Emma raised her hand and started describing Pine Ridge as it existed in the 1890s. She knew about buildings that had been torn down decades before she was born, could tell you which families had lived in which houses back then, even knew about the old mining operations in detail. That wasn't in any of our history books. When Mrs. Patterson asked how she knew all this, Emma just said her family had told her stories. But the level of detail was extraordinary. She could describe the layout of the original company store, knew the names of mine foremen from 70 years ago, could tell you exactly where the old railroad spur had run before it was torn up in the 1960s. I probably should have been more concerned right then, but honestly, I was impressed. We had a genuinely gifted student on our hands, and I was already thinking about how to challenge her academically without making the other children feel left out. Then, about 2 weeks later, we got another new enrollment. The Hendricks twins, James and Joseph, also 2nd grade. Same story. Family had just moved to the area from up the mountain, perfectly filled out paperwork, polite parents who spoke in that same formal, old-fashioned way. The boys were as well-behaved and advanced as Emma, and they seemed to know her already, though they claimed they'd never met before starting school. Over the next month, we enrolled 4 more new students: Billy Matthews, age 7, Sarah Ann Cooper, age 9, Michael and Rebecca Thornton, ages 8 and 10. All from families who'd supposedly just moved to the area, all with the same pale, serious appearance and unnaturally advanced knowledge of local history. What really started to bother me was how these children interacted, or rather how they didn't interact, with the other students. They were perfectly polite to everyone, never caused any trouble, always followed directions. But during recess, instead of playing on the swings or joining in games of tag, they would stand together in small groups near the edge of the playground, whispering to each other in what sounded almost like a different language. Not Spanish or any foreign language I recognized, but something that had an older, more archaic sound to it. The other children found them strange too, but couldn't really articulate why. When I asked some of our longtime students about the new kids, they'd shrug and say things like, "They're nice enough, but they're weird," or "they talk funny." Nobody was being mean to them, but nobody was becoming friends with them either. By November, I was curious enough to start doing some checking on my own. I called the state education department to verify the transfer records for all 7 children. What I found made my stomach drop. There were no records of any of these children in the state database. No previous enrollments, no test scores, nothing. It was as if they'd never attended school anywhere before Pine Ridge Elementary. That's when I started looking more closely at the addresses the families had provided. Every single one was for a house or property that, according to county records, had been abandoned for at least 20 years. Some of them were addresses for homes that had burned down or been condemned decades ago. I decided to take a drive up into the mountains that weekend to see what I could find. The addresses led me up increasingly narrow dirt roads, past properties that were obviously deserted, collapsing barns, houses with missing roofs, yards grown over with weeds and saplings. But as I got higher up the mountain, following the directions to Emma's address, I started seeing signs of life. Smoke coming from chimneys of houses that looked like they should have been uninhabitable. Lights in windows of buildings that I was pretty sure didn't have electrical service. The smell of cooking food drifting from properties that hadn't had residents in living memory. When I finally found the house matching Emma's address, I sat in my car for a long time, just staring. It was a 2-story farmhouse that I knew for a fact had been empty since the 1980 seconds. I'd driven past it dozens of times over the years. But now there were curtains in the windows, a garden in the front yard, children's toys on the porch. Smoke was coming from the chimney, and I could hear voices from inside. I almost turned around and left, but my curiosity got the better of me. I knocked on the door, and Mrs. Fairchild answered, smiling pleasantly and inviting me in for coffee, as if my visit was perfectly normal. The inside of the house was like stepping back in time. The furniture looked like it belonged in a museum. Heavy wooden pieces, doilies on every surface, oil lamps alongside electric lights. The photographs on the mantelpiece showed the same families I'd met at school, but the pictures seemed to span different time periods. Some looked like they were from the 1920 seconds. Others from the 1950 seconds. But the people in them never seemed to age. I asked Mrs. Fairchild about Emma's father, and she said, with that same pleasant smile, "He's working in the mine. Always working in the mine." But I knew there hadn't been active mining operations in the area since the fresh 1960 seconds. That night, I couldn't sleep. I spent hours on my computer, searching through historical records, census data, newspaper archives. What I found made me feel sick to my stomach. Every one of the family names, Fairchild, Hendricks, Matthews, Cooper, Thornton, appeared in local census records going back over a century. But here's the thing that made my hands shake as I scrolled through the data. The names never changed. Not just the last names, but the first names too. Emma Fairchild appeared in the 1920 census, listed as age 8. James and Joseph Hendricks were in the 1950 census, also listed as children. The same names, same ages, appearing in records spanning decades. The pattern was always the same. The families would be listed in census data for a few years, then disappear completely, only to reappear 20 or 30 years later with the same names and same ages. Like they were cycling through time, coming and going in regular intervals. I found newspaper clippings too. Reports of mining accidents, cave-ins, explosions that had killed entire families. The Fairchilds died in a mine collapse in 1952. The Hendricks family was killed in 1943 when methane gas exploded in the tunnel where they were working. Every one of the families I'd enrolled had been reported dead in mining accidents decades ago. Monday morning, I could barely function. I kept staring at those 7 children during the morning assembly, seeing not 8 and 9-year-olds, but something else entirely. Something that had been 8 and 9 years old for longer than I'd been alive. After classes started, I called Emma down to the office. She came in with that same serious expression, hands folded, sitting primly in the chair across from my desk. "Emma?" I said, my voice probably shakier than I wanted it to be. "How old are you really?" She looked at me with those gray eyes that suddenly seemed ancient, far too old for her small face. "How old is the mountain, Miss Sarah?" Before I could respond, the other 6 children appeared in my doorway. I hadn't called them down. I hadn't heard them walking down the hallway. They just appeared, standing quietly behind Emma, all of them staring at me with those same ancient eyes. "We go to school when it's safe," Emma said softly. "When people forget what happened in the mines." "We were just children," said one of the Hendricks twins. "We were supposed to be in school that day, but Daddy needed help in the mine." "The mountain keeps us together," Sarah Ann Cooper added. "But we can only come back when people stop looking for what's buried down there." I felt like I was going to be sick. "What happened to you?" Emma's expression grew sad, and for a moment she looked like the 8-year-old she appeared to be. "There was an accident in 1952. Gas explosion in the main shaft. Daddy and Uncle James and all the men were working down there. The whole mountain shook. Something else was down there too," Billy Matthews said quietly. "Something that had been sleeping under the mountain for a long, long time. The explosion woke it up. It was angry about being disturbed," Rebecca Thornton whispered. "It took our families, all of us. But it also protected us. Kept us safe, keeps us together. But now people are talking about opening the mines again," Emma said, and her voice carried a weight of sadness that no child should ever have to bear. "We heard them talking in town. New mining permits, new equipment, new plans. I understood then. These children, these families, they were trying to live normal lives, to have the childhood that had been stolen from them, but only during the periods when the mountains were left alone. When mining stopped, they could emerge and pretend to be normal families with normal children. But when the mining started up again, you have to disappear," I said. Emma nodded. "The mountain calls us back. And what's down there? It gets angry when people disturb the deep places. We try to warn them, but nobody ever listens." That night, I sat in my office, long after everyone had gone home, and systematically destroyed every piece of enrollment paperwork for those 7 children. I deleted their files from the computer system, removed their names from class rosters, even went through and photoshopped them out of class pictures. If any authorities came asking questions about mining permits or safety surveys, they wouldn't find any trace of families living up in those mountains. The next Monday, their desks were empty. When I asked Mrs. Patterson about Emma Fairchild, she looked at me blankly and asked who I was talking about. None of the staff remembered any of the new students. Even the other children seemed to have forgotten they'd ever existed. But I remembered. I still have one class photo on my desk, the one I couldn't bring myself to alter. 7 empty spaces where those children should be standing. Gaps in the rows that nobody else seems to notice. Last month, I heard the rumors that made me decide to retire early. New mining company, new permits, plans to reopen some of the old shafts with modern equipment and safety procedures. They're talking about it like it's progress, like it's going to bring jobs and prosperity back to Pine Ridge. I handed in my resignation the next day and put my house up for sale. I'm moving back to Knoxville, where the mountains are far away, and the closest thing to mining is limestone quarries. Because I know what's coming. Those families will disappear again, pulled back into whatever dark place under the mountain has been keeping them alive all these decades. And something that's been sleeping peacefully will wake up angry. When they start blasting and digging in those mountains, they're going to find more than coal seams down there. They're going to disturb something that's been waiting patiently for people to forget. The lessons of 1952. I just hope whoever takes over as principal at Pine Ridge Elementary is smart enough to recognize the warning signs when the next generation of mountain children shows up at enrollment, pale and serious, and speaking with voices older than time. And I hope they're brave enough to help them when the time comes to disappear again. Because looking back now, I realize those 7 children weren't just trying to live normal lives. They were trying to protect everyone else from what's sleeping under the mountain, standing guard during the quiet years, ready to carry their families back into the darkness when the digging starts again. I still wake up some nights thinking about Emma's question, "How old is the mountain, Miss Sarah?" I never did figure out the answer, and honestly, I don't think I want to know. I'm 42 years old and I've been carrying mail through the mountain routes around here for the better part of 15 years now. It's honest work, pays decent enough, and honestly, I like the solitude. Always have. My name's Janet, and after my divorce back in '09, I specifically requested the rural routes. Less drama, fewer people trying to flag you down with complaints about late deliveries or bent magazines. Just me, my truck, and the winding roads that snake through these old hollows. Pine Hollow's been on my route since I started. It's one of those places that time kind of forgot. Maybe 30 families scattered across about 8 miles of narrow valley, most of them living in houses their grandparents built. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where kids grow up and either stay forever or leave and never come back. I knew every mailbox, every dog that had come barking at my truck, every kid who'd wave from their front porch. Mrs. Morrison always had sweet tea, ready if I needed to cool off in summer. The Chen family ran a little vegetable stand at the end of their driveway. The Henderson place sat up on the ridge, where Billy Henderson lived with his mom after he came back from Iraq with a bad leg and worse dreams. That's what made it so strange when I started seeing children I didn't recognize. Or rather, children I recognized too well. The first time was about 3 weeks ago, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. I was running maybe 20 minutes behind schedule because Mrs. Patterson down in the main valley had needed help getting a package up to her porch. Her arthritis was acting up again. The mountain air was crisp, that perfect kind of October weather where you can still feel summer in the sunlight but winter's hiding in the shadows. I was coming up the hill toward the Morrison mailbox when I saw her. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, standing right next to the post. She had on a yellow sundress with little white flowers, and her brown hair was pulled back in 2 neat pigtails. She looked exactly like Emma Morrison, down to the gap between her front teeth and the way she stood with one foot turned slightly inward. The only problem was that Emma Morrison had moved to Ohio with her daddy last year when her parents got divorced. I slowed my truck to a stop and rolled down the window. The little girl looked up at me with big brown eyes, completely calm, like she'd been waiting for me. "Hey there, sweetie," I called out. "Where are your parents?" She tilted her head slightly, and when she smiled, it was Emma's smile exactly. "They're coming home soon," she said in that same high, clear voice I remembered. "They always come home." I looked around, but the Morrison house was dark. Helen Morrison had moved down to Asheville to be closer to her sister after the divorce. The place had been empty for months. "Honey, are you lost? How did you get here?" But when I looked back toward the mailbox, she was gone. Just vanished, like she'd never been there at all. I sat there for a good 5 minutes, engine idling, looking around the empty yard and trying to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. Maybe the morning light had played tricks on me. I delivered the mail, just some catalogs for the house's new owner who hadn't moved in yet, and continued on my route. But I couldn't shake the image of that little girl, standing so perfectly still next to the mailbox like she belonged there. The next day, it was a boy. I was coming around the bend near the old Chen place when I saw him sitting on the front steps. Tommy Chen, maybe 8 years old, wearing the same red Cardinals t-shirt he'd loved so much. Dark hair falling over his forehead, thin legs stretched out in front of him, chin propped on his hands like he was bored and waiting for something interesting to happen. Tommy Chen had died in a car accident 5 years ago. I'd been to his funeral. I'd watched his parents, David and Lynn, break down as they lowered his small casket into the ground up at the mountain cemetery. I delivered sympathy cards to their house for weeks afterward, watched them age years in the span of months. They'd moved away 2 years later, couldn't bear to stay in the house where his room remained exactly as he'd left it. But there he was, looking exactly the same age as when he died, sitting on those front steps like he'd been waiting for the mail truck to come up the hill. I stopped the truck and got out this time. My hands were shaking as I walked toward the porch. "Tommy," I called out. He looked up at me and grinned, that same crooked smile that had always made the corners of his eyes crinkle. "Hi, Miss Janet. "Do you have any mail for my family today?" His voice was exactly right. The same slight lisp on his S sounds, the same way he always called me Miss Janet even though I'd told him a dozen times that just Janet was fine. "Tommy, sweetie." I stopped at the bottom of the steps, my heart hammering in my chest. "Your family doesn't live here anymore." He nodded seriously, like this was perfectly reasonable information. "I know. But they'll be back. They always come back eventually." I stood there staring at him, and he stared back with those dark eyes that held no confusion, no fear. Just a kind of patient certainty that made my skin crawl. When I blinked, he was gone. Just like that. Empty steps, empty house, just the sound of wind moving through the trees and my own ragged breathing. I started keeping a list after that. Every time I saw one of the children, I wrote down the details. Who they looked like, what they were wearing, what they said. The list got longer every day. Sarah Williams from the old Williams farm, dead of leukemia 3 years ago. Standing by their mailbox in her favorite purple dress, asking if her grandma had sent any letters. The Martinez twins, Miguel and Carlos, who'd moved to Florida when their dad got transferred. Playing in the yard of their old house like they'd never left, identical grins on their sun-darkened faces. Little Beth Santos, who'd fallen through the ice on Miller's Pond when she was 4. Sitting on the tire swing behind her family's old house, pumping her legs like she was trying to get higher, singing nursery rhymes in a voice that sounded like it was coming from underwater. Each time, they'd ask about mail for their families. Each time, they'd say their parents were coming home soon. And each time, when I looked away for just a second, they'd disappear. I tried to convince myself I was having some kind of breakdown. Maybe the isolation was getting to me more than I'd thought. Maybe I needed to talk to someone, get some help. But the children looked so real, so perfectly detailed. I could see the freckles on Emma Morrison's nose, the small scar on Tommy Chen's, me from where he'd fallen off his bike. These weren't hallucinations or dreams. They were exact copies of children I'd known, down to the smallest details. The worst part was how normal they acted. They weren't ghostly or transparent or obviously supernatural. They moved and talked and smiled like regular kids. It was only when you really looked at them, when you paid attention to the little things, that you started to notice something was wrong. Their movements were too perfect, too deliberate. Real children fidget and scratch and shift their weight. These children stood absolutely still until they needed to move. Then moved with an odd kind of fluid precision, like they were copying the memory of movement rather than actually feeling the impulse to move. And their eyes never blinked at quite the right intervals. Last Monday, I saw 6 of them together. I was running my usual route when I noticed them playing in the field behind the ruins of the old Pine Hollow schoolhouse. The building had been abandoned since the county consolidated the schools back in the 82nds, and it was mostly just foundation stones and broken concrete now, covered in kudzu and volunteer trees. But there they were. Emma Morrison, Tommy Chen, the Martinez twins, Beth Santos, and Billy Henderson. Not the grown-up Billy who lived with his mom on the ridge, but the 8-year-old Billy I remembered from before he'd enlisted, before Iraq, before whatever happened over there had broken something inside him. They were playing Ring Around the Rosie, holding hands in a perfect circle, moving in that same unnaturally fluid way. I could hear them singing, but the words weren't right. It wasn't the nursery rhyme I knew. It was something else, something that made my teeth ache and my stomach turn. The language sounded old, older than English, older than anything that should exist in these mountains. I parked the truck and walked closer, drawn by a fascination that overpowered my growing terror. As I got nearer, I could see their faces more clearly. They were smiling, all of them, identical serene smiles that never wavered even as they sang their horrible song. When they noticed me watching, they all stopped at exactly the same moment. 6 heads turned toward me in perfect unison, 6 pairs of eyes focused on my face with an intensity that made my knees weak. "Do you have mail for us?" they asked in perfect synchronization, their voices blending into a single sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I turned and ran. I'm not proud of that, but I ran like my life depended on it. Behind me, I could hear them following, their feet moving in perfect rhythm on the dry grass, their voices calling out the same question over and over. "Do you have mail for us? Do you have mail for us?" I made it to my truck and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. In the rearview mirror, I could see them standing at the edge of the road, watching me. But as I watched, their faces began to change. Emma Morrison's features shifted and blurred, becoming Sarah Williams, then Beth Santos, then children I didn't recognize, other kids from other times, maybe other places. The Martinez twins melted and reformed into a single child, then split again into completely different faces. Tommy Chen's body stretched and compressed like he was made of clay, cycling through different heights and ages and expressions. They were mimicking the memories of children from Pine Hollow, I realized, copying the shapes and voices and mannerisms of kids who'd lived here, or died here, or moved away. Something had been watching these families for years, maybe decades, learning how to replicate their lost children perfectly. But it was getting the details wrong in small, terrible ways. The too perfect movements, the synchronized speech, the way they all had the same patient, watching expression, regardless of whose face they wore. I called in sick the next day, and the day after that. I couldn't bring myself to drive back up into Pine Hollow, couldn't face the possibility of seeing those things again. But when I went back to work on Thursday, my supervisor pulled me aside. "Janet, I've been getting calls from the families on your route," he said. "They're complaining that their children aren't getting their mail." I stared at him. "What children?" He consulted his clipboard. "The Morrisons say their daughter Emma hasn't gotten the birthday cards her grandmother's been sending. The Chens are upset because their boy Tommy's pen pal letters aren't being delivered. Apparently these kids have been staying with their families again, and they're expecting mail." My mouth went dry. "Sir, those families don't live in Pine Hollow anymore. And those children, they're dead. Or they moved away years ago." He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Janet, I don't know what kind of stress you're under, but I've got families calling me upset because their kids aren't getting mail. You need to do your job." I tried to explain, but how do you tell someone that an entire hollow is being haunted by perfect copies of dead children? How do you say that something is mimicking lost kids so well that it's fooling their own parents? So I went back. The families were all there, the ones who'd moved away years ago. Helen Morrison was back in her old house, setting the table for 3 instead of 1. David and Lynn Chen were in their front yard, David pushing Tommy on the tire swing they'd taken down after his funeral. The Martinez family was hanging laundry on the line behind their old farmhouse, their twins helping fold sheets with those too precise movements, and the children looked perfect. Exactly like themselves, exactly like they should be, except for the eyes. The eyes that watched everything with an ancient, patient hunger. I delivered the mail with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. At each house, the children would run up to the truck, asking if there was anything for them, thanking me politely when I handed over letters and packages that shouldn't exist, addresses for families that had moved away or children who were dead. The worst was the Henderson place. Mrs. Henderson met me at the mailbox, looking happier than I'd seen her in years. "Billy's been staying with us again," she said, her eyes bright with joy. "He never really left, you know. He just needed some time to himself." Through the front window, I could see him sitting on the couch. Billy Henderson, 8 years old, in his Little League uniform, watching cartoons. But his uniform was rotting, falling apart in places, and when he turned toward the window to wave at me, I saw that his face was wrong, like someone had tried to remember what Billy looked like as a child, but had only ever seen photographs, and old photographs at that. The thing wearing Billy's shape waved at me with fingers that bent at angles that made my stomach lurch. When it smiled, I could see that it had too many teeth, or not enough, or the wrong kind entirely. I fled Pine Hollow that day, and I haven't been back since. I requested a transfer, got assigned to routes in the valley where things make sense and children are just children. But I know they're still up there. All those perfect copies, living with families who want their lost children back so desperately that they'll accept anything that wears the right face. And I know they're learning. Every day, they study how to be more human. They watch and copy and practice until the mimicry becomes perfect, until even the little wrong details get corrected. They're studying not just the children they're copying, but the families too, learning how parents and siblings and neighbors are supposed to act. I tried to warn people, called the sheriff, called social services, even called some of the families directly. But no one wants to listen. They have their children back, and that's all that matters to them. They don't want to hear that something is wrong, that their kids move too smoothly, or speak in unison, or have eyes that never blink at the right intervals. The post office assigned a new carrier to Pine Hollow. Nice kid, just out of college, excited to have a job. I thought about warning him, but what would I say? That an entire community is living with things that pretend to be children? That something ancient and hungry is using their grief against them? He'll figure it out on his own soon enough. Or maybe he won't. Maybe he'll just see happy families with their children and think everything's normal. But I know what I saw up there. I know that Pine Hollow is full of families living with perfect copies of their lost children, and that those copies are getting better at being human every single day. And someday, when they've learned everything they need to know about being people, they'll start replacing the living too. I still deliver mail in these mountains, just to different hollows now. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder about the families in other places, the ones who've lost children, who'd give anything to have them back. And I wonder if what's happening in Pine Hollow is spreading, moving from valley to valley like some kind of infection, giving people exactly what they think they want. I don't sleep as well as I used to, and I never look too closely at children anymore, especially the ones who stand too still or move too perfectly or ask too politely if there's any mail for them today. Because sometimes, when the light hits them just right, I can see something else looking back at me through their eyes, something that's been watching and learning for far longer than any child should be able to. Something that knows exactly what shape to wear to make you believe it belongs,